Good, Richard Coleman said without even looking up from the stack of acquisition papers in front of him. The translator finally made it. The words landed in the Manhattan boardroom with the softness of casual conversation and the weight of a public slap. A few people chuckled under their breath. One executive smirked into his coffee cup. Another adjusted his Rolex and kept scrolling through quarterly projections on his tablet like nothing unusual had happened. And at exactly 8:42 on a rainy Thursday morning, inside the 42nd floor executive conference room of Halstead and Blythe Capital, a billion-dollar deal began collapsing before anyone realized it had already died. Naomi Carter stood silently near the glass doors, one hand resting against the strap of a slim black leather portfolio, the other tucked calmly into the pocket of her charcoal coat. She wore no diamonds, no designer logos, no flashy colors screaming wealth, just a fitted black turtleneck, tailored gray slacks, and low black heels polished enough to catch the pale light pouring through the skyline windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan. She looked composed, quiet, unimpressed, but to the people seated around the walnut conference table, she looked like support staff. Richard finally glanced up. Tall, silver-haired, expensive navy suit, the kind of white executive who carried himself like every room had belonged to him since birth. He gave Naomi a distracted wave toward the sidewall. "We'll need coffee refreshed every 30 minutes, he said. And someone should print updated Mandarin copies before the Singapore call starts. A woman beside him laughed softly. Evelyn Price, senior strategy advisor. Blonde bob, pearl earrings. The type of polished corporate presence that weaponized politeness like a knife wrapped in silk. Actually, Evelyn added with a smile too tight to be kind, have her wait outside until we begin. We don't need interruptions during negotiations. Naomi didn't move, didn't blink. The room continued around her like she wasn't fully human yet, like she existed in the background scenery of their success. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain streaked down the glass in thin silver lines. The city below moved in slow morning traffic while inside the boardroom the air stayed perfectly temperature-controlled, perfectly expensive, perfectly insulated from consequences. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Naomi Carter. She stepped further into the room with measured calm, the sound of her heels barely audible against the stone floor. No one greeted her. No one offered a seat. Richard resumed, talking to the investors gathered along the far side of the table. Once Carter Global signs off, he said confidently, the acquisition becomes the largest infrastructure merger on the East Coast this decade. Naomi's eyes moved slowly across the room. 12 executives, 3 legal advisors, 2 junior analysts near the back wall typing rapidly into laptops. And hanging above all of them was the massive digital display showing Halstead and Blythe/Carter Global Strategic Merger in bold white letters against a blue corporate background. Her name towered over the room, while the people beneath it dismissed her without hesitation. She had seen this before. At 26, a security guard once stopped her outside a tech summit in San Francisco and asked whose assistant she was. At 31, a banker in Chicago assumed the company account under her name belonged to an athlete or entertainer. At 38, a hotel concierge handed her luggage tags after she arrived for an ownership conference at a property she partially owned. Different cities, different faces, same cold assumption hiding beneath polished smiles. Naomi removed her coat slowly and draped it over the back of an empty chair near the middle of the room. That finally got their attention. Richard frowned. "Excuse me," he said sharply. "Staff seating is outside." The room quieted slightly, not fully silent, just enough for everyone to sense tension beginning to climb like pressure before a storm. Naomi looked directly at him for the first time. Calm eyes, controlled posture, the kind of stillness that unsettled people more than anger ever could. "Is it?" she asked softly. Evelyn leaned back in her chair with a small laugh. "Well, this is awkward." Another executive whispered something under his breath that made 2 others grin. Near the far corner, a young black analyst named Daniel Brooks glanced up from his laptop. His fingers froze above the keyboard. He looked from Naomi to the merger documents on his screen, then back to Naomi again. Confusion crossed his face. Recognition almost followed it. Richard sighed dramatically and checked his watch. Look, he said, voice lowering into fake professionalism. We're about to discuss a 12-figure acquisition. This room is restricted. Naomi nodded once as though considering his words seriously. 12 figures, she repeated quietly. That's correct. Richard leaned back confidently. So if you could step outside until someone actually calls for translation services, we'd appreciate it. A few people smiled again. Evelyn reached for her espresso. Daniel stared harder at the documents in front of him now, his expression tightening as if he'd just discovered something he wasn't supposed to see. And Naomi Carter finally pulled out the chair at the center of the table and sat down anyway. The sound of Naomi Carter pulling out the chair echoed louder than it should have in the silent boardroom. Not because the movement itself was dramatic, but because confidence coming from someone they had already dismissed felt almost offensive to the people sitting around that table. Richard Coleman stared at her like she had broken some invisible corporate rule by simply existing in the wrong seat. Evelyn Price lowered her espresso cup slowly, eyes narrowing with polished irritation. One investor exchanged an awkward glance with another. The room no longer felt relaxed. It felt charged. Naomi settled calmly into the leather chair positioned directly across from the presentation monitor, displaying her company name in 6-foot-wide letters. She crossed one leg over the other and placed her black portfolio neatly on the table without saying another word. Richard forced a smile that looked painful around the edges. I do not think there has been a misunderstanding here, he said carefully. This meeting is reserved for senior leadership and acquisition stakeholders only. Naomi looked around the room slowly, taking in every face like she was memorizing them for later. That sounds important, she replied. Daniel Brooks almost stopped breathing. From his corner seat near the legal team, he pulled one of the acquisition packets closer toward him and flipped rapidly through the pages. His heartbeat climbed with every line he scanned. Ownership disclosures, capital structures, executive authorizations. Then he found it. Naomi Carter, founder and majority controlling stakeholder of Carter Global Ventures. 51% voting authority. Daniel looked up sharply toward Naomi again. Richard continued speaking, unaware the room had already started turning against him in ways he could not yet see. Look, Richard sighed, leaning forward with the exhaustion of someone convinced he was being reasonable. Whoever hired you to assist with translation should have informed reception. Security protocols are stricter after the merger leaks last quarter. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Translation? Evelyn jumped in before Richard could continue. Mandarin support, she explained with fake patience. Although honestly, we are already behind schedule, so perhaps we can proceed without it. Another executive smirked. Maybe she is legal support instead. Quiet laughter drifted around the table again. Naomi did not react. That unsettled them more than anger would have. She simply sat there with perfect composure while they projected assumptions onto her like they were facts carved into stone. The rain outside intensified, tapping softly against the massive windows surrounding the conference room. Gray Manhattan light washed over polished wood surfaces and crystal water glasses lined with military precision down the center of the table. Everything inside the room looked expensive enough to intimidate ordinary people. Naomi looked completely unaffected by it. Daniel cleared his throat carefully. Richard, he started cautiously. I think there may be something you should. Richard raised a hand without even looking at him. Not now, Daniel. Daniel stopped immediately. Junior analysts did not interrupt billion-dollar negotiations. Not in rooms like this. Not around executives like Richard Coleman. Naomi noticed the exchange, but said nothing. Evelyn opened a financial binder and slid several pages across the table toward investors seated nearby. As you can see, she said confidently, Halstead and Blythe Capital will oversee operational restructuring once Carter Global transfers controlling infrastructure rights. Naomi's eyes dropped briefly to the paperwork. Then she looked back up at Evelyn. Operational restructuring, she repeated softly. Evelyn nodded. Correct. Naomi folded her hands together. Interesting. Something about the way she said it made Daniel's stomach tighten. Richard stood and walked toward the giant presentation screen mounted against the wall. Numbers illuminated behind him in blue and white graphs. Shipping routes. Energy infrastructure maps. Revenue forecasts stretching 5 years ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard announced proudly, This acquisition positions us to dominate East Coast logistics for the next decade. He pointed toward the revenue projections with the confidence of a man who already considered the deal complete. Once signatures clear this afternoon, Carter Global becomes part of something larger. Naomi watched him carefully. Does it? Richard turned back toward her, finally losing the last pieces of his patience. All right, he snapped, forcing a laugh toward the room. This has gone far enough. Who exactly are you here with? Silence settled heavily across the table. Naomi answered without hesitation. Myself. Evelyn exhaled sharply through her nose, visibly irritated now. You know what is fascinating? She said while organizing papers into perfect stacks. People always assume confidence alone gives them access to executive spaces. Naomi's gaze shifted toward her. And people always assume executive spaces belong to them. The room froze for half a second. One investor looked down immediately. Another adjusted his tie uncomfortably. Daniel stared at Naomi with growing disbelief. Richard stepped closer to the table. This is a private negotiation involving billions of dollars, he said firmly. You cannot simply walk in here pretending to belong. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair. Calm, controlled, dangerous in a way the room still could not define. Pretending, she repeated quietly. Daniel finally pushed his chair back an inch. Richard, he said again, voice tighter this time. Her name is on the acquisition authority forms. Richard barely glanced at him. Daniel. Warning filled the single word. But Daniel continued anyway. No, I mean literally. She is listed as majority control on the ownership disclosures. The room shifted instantly. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for confidence to crack around the edges. Evelyn's hand stopped moving across the papers. One investor slowly lowered his phone. Richard blinked once, then laughed dismissively. That is impossible. Daniel swallowed hard and turned the document around so the others could see it. Naomi Carter. The name sat there in black ink at the top of the page they had all signed earlier that morning without truly reading. And while confusion started spreading quietly around the boardroom like smoke under a locked door, Naomi Carter remained perfectly still at the center of it all. The silence after Daniel turned the document around felt heavier than the rain hammering against the window's 42 floors above Manhattan. Nobody reached for their coffee anymore. Nobody smiled. The room had shifted into something colder now, something uncertain. Richard Coleman stared at the ownership disclosure packet like the paper itself had betrayed him. Naomi Carter remained seated calmly at the center of the conference table, hands folded loosely, posture relaxed, expression unreadable. She did not look victorious. That almost made it worse. Evelyn Price recovered first. Executives like her always did. She gave a small, dismissive laugh and adjusted the cuff of her cream-colored blazer. Well, she said carefully, there is clearly some confusion regarding titles and representation. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Is there? Evelyn forced another smile, but the polish was beginning to crack beneath it. You understand these transactions involve multiple holding entities, legal proxies, strategic partners. Names appear on documents all the time. Naomi nodded slowly as though genuinely interested in hearing how far Evelyn planned to take the explanation. They do, she replied softly. Richard finally pulled the folder from Daniel's hands and scanned the page himself. His jaw tightened immediately. The color in his face shifted almost imperceptibly. 51% controlling stake. Executive authorization required for all transfer approvals. Final signature authority, Naomi Carter. Richard closed the folder too quickly. This should have been communicated beforehand, he said sharply, redirecting blame toward the room itself instead of himself. Naomi watched him without blinking. Communicated to who? Richard ignored the question. We expected Carter global legal representation today, not. He stopped before finishing the sentence. Not what? Not a black woman in a black turtleneck without diamonds? Not someone quiet enough to mistake for staff? The unfinished thought hung in the air anyway. Everyone heard it. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair. Not me, she asked. The room stayed silent. Daniel lowered his eyes toward his laptop, uncomfortable now in a way deeper than embarrassment. He had seen moments like this before growing up in Atlanta. Teachers assuming his white classmates were smarter before tests even started. Store managers following his father through department stores while pretending not to. The room suddenly felt familiar to him in the worst possible way. Richard cleared his throat and straightened his tie. Miss Carter, he said carefully, emphasizing the name now with forced professionalism. If there has been any misunderstanding regarding your role here today, I assure you that was never intentional. Naomi's eyes moved toward the giant presentation monitor still displaying the merger branding across the screen. Carter Global Strategic Acquisition. Her company name still dominated the wall above them like a silent accusation. Interesting word, she said quietly. Richard frowned slightly. What word? Intentional. Evelyn stepped in quickly before the conversation slipped further from her control. I think everyone here values professionalism, she said smoothly. Perhaps we should simply move forward with the meeting. Naomi looked directly at her. Professionalism. Again, the repetition sounded more dangerous than confrontation. One of the investors near the far end of the table shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Another began quietly checking emails on his phone, desperate to avoid eye contact. The atmosphere no longer felt like a business negotiation. It felt like a courtroom moments before a verdict. Richard attempted to regain authority. All right, he announced, clapping his hands once as if resetting the room. Let us continue. He walked back toward the presentation screen and resumed discussing logistics infrastructure projections with slightly less confidence than before. As I was saying, he continued, once operational control transfers, Halstead and Blythe Capital will oversee restructuring initiatives to improve efficiency across all East Coast routes. Naomi listened quietly. Every few seconds, she glanced down at the documents spread across the table. Her expression never changed, but Daniel noticed something the others missed. She was not reviewing the acquisition terms anymore. She was reviewing the people, measuring them, cataloging every interruption, every assumption, every carefully hidden layer of disrespect beneath their polished corporate language. Evelyn began speaking again, this time directing her words toward Naomi with exaggerated patience. Naturally, she explained, the transition process can feel overwhelming for founders emotionally attached to their companies. Naomi looked up slowly. Emotionally attached. Evelyn smiled politely. You built something meaningful. It is understandable. Naomi folded one page neatly inside the folder before responding. You assume I came here to surrender it. Richard jumped back into the conversation before Evelyn could answer. No one is talking about surrender, he said. This is strategic expansion. Naomi's gaze settled on him again. Calm. Precise. Then why did your team prepare termination language for my regional leadership staff? Richard froze. Evelyn immediately reached for the document stack in front of her. Too late. Naomi already had the page in her hand. Page 47. Naomi continued softly. Section 8. Immediate restructuring authority. Elimination of local executive oversight within 90 days. The room tightened again. One investor whispered quietly to another. Daniel stared at Naomi with growing admiration now. She was not reacting emotionally. She was dismantling them line by line with their own paperwork. Richard forced a thin smile. Those are standard efficiency measures. Naomi nodded once. For people you think are replaceable. The words sliced through the room with surgical precision. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the city. Daniel noticed Richard's confidence slipping faster now. Sweat had started forming near his collar despite the cold temperature inside the conference room. Evelyn adjusted her papers again, buying time. Naomi closed the folder carefully and rested both hands on top of it. Then she looked around the room one slow time, meeting every pair of eyes individually. You know what fascinates me? She asked quietly. Nobody answered. Naomi's voice stayed calm enough to force everyone else into silence. Every person in this room assumed I was unqualified before I said a single word. The air itself seemed to stop moving. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Naomi continued before he could. Not because of the documents. Not because of the numbers. Not because of experience. Her eyes settled directly on Richard Coleman. You decided who belonged here the second I walked through that door. Nobody answered Naomi Carter after that. The conference room sat frozen beneath the pale gray light spilling through the rain-covered windows, and for the first time that morning, Richard Coleman looked uncertain inside his own boardroom. It was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a pause half a second too long before speaking. The kind of crack powerful people spent their entire lives trying to hide. Naomi saw it immediately. So did Daniel Brooks. The young analyst lowered his eyes toward the acquisition documents again, but he was no longer pretending to work. He was watching history unfold in real time. Evelyn Price attempted to steady the room with another polished corporate smile. "I think emotions are beginning to cloud the conversation," she said carefully. Naomi turned toward her slowly. "You think this is emotional?" Evelyn hesitated. Only for a moment. But moments mattered in rooms built on power. "I think misunderstandings happen," Evelyn replied, "particularly in high-pressure negotiations." Naomi nodded once. "Misunderstandings." She repeated the word the same way someone might examine a crack in glass before deciding whether the entire structure was about to collapse. Richard stepped back toward the head of the conference table and pressed a button on the presentation remote. Revenue projections returned to the massive monitor behind him. Blue graphs, rising market forecasts, billion-dollar optimism glowing across the wall like nothing underneath it had shifted. "Let us stay focused," Richard announced firmly. "We are discussing one of the largest infrastructure acquisitions in modern East Coast logistics." Naomi folded her hands together calmly. "And yet none of you bothered," recognizing the person approving it. Richard ignored the statement completely. "Or tried to." "Daniel," he said sharply, "continue distributing the updated valuation packets." Daniel did not move immediately. Richard looked at him again. "Daniel." The younger man finally stood, gathering folders from the side table with stiff movements. But something inside him had already changed. He had spent 3 years at Halstead and Blythe learning how silence worked in rooms like this. Silence protected careers. Silence protected power. Silence protected executives who humiliated people while calling it professionalism. Yet now every step he took around that conference table felt heavier than before. He handed one investor a packet, then another. When he reached Naomi, their eyes met briefly. Calm met conscience. Naomi accepted the folder with a small nod. Nothing dramatic. Nothing spoken aloud. But Daniel suddenly remembered his mother standing behind a hospital reception desk in Atlanta while patients ignored her instructions and looked directly at white nurses instead. He remembered how exhausted she sounded at dinner some nights. Not angry, just tired. Tired of proving herself to people already committed to misunderstanding her. "Thank you," Naomi said quietly as Daniel handed over the packet. 2 simple words. Respectful. Human. Daniel swallowed hard and stepped back toward the wall. Richard resumed speaking. "As outlined in Section 12, operational restructuring begins immediately following the final authorization transfer." Naomi opened the folder slowly. "Immediately," she repeated. Richard nodded. "Efficiency requires decisive action." Naomi scanned the pages in silence while the room watched her more carefully now. Nobody interrupted anymore. Nobody laughed. The arrogance from earlier had started retreating beneath layers of legal caution. But the damage had already settled into the walls. Naomi turned another page. Then another. "Interesting," she said softly. Richard forced a confident smile. "I assume you are satisfied with the revised terms." Naomi looked up at him. "You eliminated every senior regional director from Detroit, Baltimore, and Newark." Richard spread his hands slightly. "Redundancies." Naomi's eyes narrowed almost invisibly. Every single one was black. The room went silent again. Not because anyone wanted to admit it. Because they had not expected her to notice so quickly. Evelyn leaned forward immediately. "Now hold on," she said with controlled irritation. "Those decisions were based entirely on metrics." Naomi looked directly at her. "Which metrics?" Evelyn opened her mouth, closed it again. Richard jumped in before the silence exposed too much. "We are talking about operational performance." Naomi slid one page carefully across the table. "This director increased shipping efficiency in Baltimore by 19%. Another page followed. "This one cut fuel losses across Newark routes by $11 million in 14 months. Another page. "And this executive expanded Detroit freight capacity during the worst supply chain backlog in a decade." She looked up slowly. "So explain the metrics." Nobody answered immediately. Rain continued sliding down the windows behind them in silver streaks, while thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the skyline. The conference room no longer felt luxurious. It felt exposed. Richard's jaw tightened again. "You are reading too deeply into restructuring language." Naomi gave a faint smile that never reached her eyes. "No, I am reading it exactly as written." Daniel watched the investors now. One older man near the end of the table had stopped pretending to review financial notes entirely. Another kept rubbing his wedding ring nervously while glancing between Naomi and Richard. The balance of the room was shifting inch by inch, almost invisibly, but Naomi could feel it happening. So could Richard. Powerful men always sensed when authority began slipping away from them. Evelyn tried once more to regain control. "Miss Carter," she said carefully, "surely you understand difficult decisions are part of executive leadership." Naomi looked at her calmly. "I do." Evelyn straightened slightly, believing she had found common ground. Then Naomi continued, "That is why I pay attention to who gets sacrificed first." The words landed harder than shouting ever could have. Daniel saw Richard's face change again. Not anger this time. Concern. Real concern. Because somewhere beneath the tension and polished corporate language, he was finally beginning to realize something dangerous. Naomi Carter had not walked into that boardroom unprepared. She had walked in already knowing exactly who they were. The room stayed quiet after Naomi Carter finished speaking, but it was no longer the controlled silence of corporate professionalism. This silence felt unstable, fragile. Like everyone inside the conference room suddenly understood they were standing on ice that had already started cracking beneath them. Richard Coleman loosened his grip on the presentation remote and forced another smile that looked thinner every minute. "You are making serious assumptions," he said carefully. Naomi closed the folder in front of her with deliberate precision. "No," she replied softly. "I am recognizing familiar patterns." "Evelyn." Price folded her arms. "This company employs thousands of people across multiple regions," she said. "Restructuring is not personal." Naomi's expression did not change. "It always becomes personal for the people removed first." Rain continued sliding across the massive windows overlooking Manhattan, while muted thunder rolled somewhere beyond the skyline. The city below kept moving. Yellow taxis, crowded sidewalks, steam rising from street vents. Ordinary people living ordinary mornings while inside the 42nd floor boardroom. Billion-dollar executives were beginning to realize they had underestimated the one person controlling the entire deal. Daniel Brooks stood near the wall holding his tablet against his chest, watching Naomi carefully now. The room saw calm. He saw memory. There was something in her eyes he recognized from his own mother after difficult days at the hospital. Not anger. Not fear. Exhaustion sharpened into discipline over years of surviving spaces never built to welcome you. Richard stepped away from the presentation screen and returned to the table, attempting to reclaim authority through proximity alone. "Miss Carter," he said, lowering his voice into corporate diplomacy, "perhaps we should reset the tone here. We all want this partnership to succeed." Naomi looked directly at him. "Do we?" Richard paused. "Of course." Naomi rested one hand lightly against the closed folder in front of her. "Then explain why your legal team prepared contingency language removing every community investment initiative my company built over the last decade." Evelyn immediately reached for another document. Too slow again. Naomi already had the page open. Page 62. Naomi continued quietly. "Educational grants suspended. Minority supplier partnerships terminated. Local apprenticeship programs dissolved after acquisition finalization." One investor frowned visibly now while scanning the paperwork himself. Another slowly removed his glasses as if reading the language more carefully might somehow change what was written there. Richard exhaled sharply. "Those are temporary reallocations." Naomi nodded once. "For neighborhoods your board has never visited." The words settled heavily across the room. Daniel felt something twist in his chest. He had grown up in neighborhoods executives only referenced during campaign donations or marketing presentations. He knew exactly what Naomi meant. To men like Richard Coleman, communities became numbers the second they appeared inside spreadsheets. Naomi looked toward the rain-covered windows for the first time since entering the room. For a brief moment, the boardroom disappeared from her expression entirely, and memory replaced it. 15 years earlier, Naomi stood beside her mother inside a downtown Philadelphia office tower 2 days before Christmas. Her mother wore a Navy janitor uniform and pushed a cleaning cart through marble hallways after midnight, while corporate executives laughed inside holiday parties behind glass walls. Naomi had been 19, home from college, waiting quietly while her mother finished the shift. One executive walked past them carrying a half-empty champagne glass, and dropped it carelessly onto the cleaning cart without even looking at her mother's face. "Can somebody clear this?" he said while continuing down the hallway. Not cruel loudly. Worse, casual. Like dignity itself had levels assigned to it. Naomi remembered her mother picking up the glass silently. Remembered the tired smile she forced afterward. "Do not let this place teach you who you are," her mother whispered that night while emptying trash bags beneath fluorescent lights. Back inside the Manhattan boardroom, Naomi blinked once and the memory disappeared. But the feeling remained. Richard misread her silence completely. "I understand founders become emotionally invested in social initiatives," he said carefully, "but acquisitions require practical compromises." Naomi turned back toward him slowly. "My mother cleaned office buildings for 23 years, she said quietly. The room stilled instantly. Nobody interrupted. People walked past her every night pretending not to see her, Naomi continued. Then they stood on stages talking about leadership and values the next morning. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Richard remained silent now. Naomi's voice never rose above calm conversation, but every word seemed to tighten around the room like wire. "The first thing powerful people remove is always dignity," she said. "Because once people stop feeling seen, they stop believing they deserve protection." Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment. One investor quietly closed his folder altogether. Another leaned back slowly, no longer looking certain about anything connected to the acquisition. Naomi rested both hands against the table and looked directly at Richard Coleman again. "You walked into this meeting prepared to erase entire communities while asking me to call it efficiency." Richard finally responded, irritation creeping beneath his controlled tone again. "Now hold on. Nobody is erasing anyone." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "You already tried." The room went silent again. Not performative silence. Not strategic silence. The kind of silence people fall into when truth arrives before they are emotionally prepared to hear it. Outside, lightning flashed faintly beyond the skyline. Inside, Richard Coleman looked around the conference table and realized something dangerous had happened while he was busy defending himself. People were no longer looking at Naomi Carter like she did not belong there. They were beginning to look at him like maybe he never deserved the room as much as he believed. Richard Coleman tried to recover the room with the confidence of a man who had spent decades believing authority alone could control perception. He straightened the cuffs of his navy suit, adjusted the presentation remote in his hand, and forced another version of his executive smile across his face. But the room no longer moved with him. That was the problem. A few minutes earlier, every voice in the conference room followed Richard naturally. Investors nodded when he spoke. Legal advisors watched him for cues. Even silence used to protect him. Now people kept glancing toward Naomi Carter instead. Quietly, carefully, like they were waiting to see what she would do next. Richard noticed it too. "We are losing focus," he announced sharply. "This meeting exists to finalize a strategic merger, not debate social philosophy." Naomi sat perfectly still at the center of the long walnut table. "You think dignity is philosophy?" Richard exhaled through his nose. "I think this conversation is becoming unproductive." Naomi gave the smallest nod imaginable. "Finally," she said softly, "we agree on something." Daniel Brooks almost looked down to hide the reaction crossing his face. The line landed harder than shouting would have. Across the room, one investor coughed awkwardly into his hand, while another quietly closed the acquisition binder entirely. Nobody cared about the projections anymore. The atmosphere had changed too completely. The boardroom no longer felt like a negotiation space. It felt like exposure. Naomi reached calmly into her black leather portfolio and removed a slim silver phone. The movement itself looked ordinary, but something about the precision of it tightened the room instantly. Richard watched her carefully now. No more dismissive smiles. No more assumptions about translators or assistants. Just caution. Naomi glanced once at the screen, then pressed a single contact. "Sophia," she said calmly when the line connected. Her voice never rose, never trembled. "Activate Protocol 9. The room froze. Richard frowned immediately. "What is Protocol 9? Naomi ended the call without answering him. A few seconds passed. Then another. Rain tapped softly against the windows. While nobody moved, Daniel felt his heartbeat climbing again. Even the legal advisors near the back wall looked uncertain now. Richard attempted a laugh that sounded strained around the edges. I assume this is some sort of negotiation tactic. Naomi folded her hands together once more. No, she replied quietly. It is a response. Evelyn Price leaned forward sharply. Response to what? Naomi looked directly at her. Everything. Before anyone could respond, phones around the room began vibrating almost simultaneously. One executive reached for his device first, then another, then another. The sound spread across the conference table like dominoes falling in slow motion. Richard pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and looked down. The color drained from his face immediately. Transfer authorization suspended. Pending executive review. Evelyn checked hers next. Then the lead legal advisor beside her. Confusion turned into alarm almost instantly. What is this? Evelyn asked sharply. Naomi remained calm. The wire transfer has been frozen. Richard looked up so fast his chair nearly shifted backward. You cannot do that. Naomi's expression stayed perfectly composed. I already did. Daniel stared toward the presentation monitor as the acquisition timeline suddenly disappeared from the screen. The blue graphs blinked once before being replaced by a white system notification. Executive authorization revoked. Pending internal review. One investor muttered a curse beneath his breath. Another immediately stood and stepped away from the table to answer a phone call coming through his earpiece. Richard moved toward Naomi now, not aggressively, but desperately enough for the room to feel it. Miss Carter, he said tightly, you are overreacting. Naomi looked up at him. No. Her voice stayed calm enough to make the word feel final. I am correcting a mistake. Evelyn tried stepping back into control. This merger has taken 11 months to negotiate, she said. You cannot suspend everything because someone offended you. Naomi's eyes shifted toward her slowly. You still think this is about my feelings? Silence answered her. Somewhere beyond the windows, lightning flashed faintly over Manhattan. Inside the boardroom, panic had begun creeping beneath expensive suits and polished executive language. Daniel watched one legal advisor rapidly typing into his laptop while whispering into a headset. Another investor had already started calculating losses out loud under his breath. Millions delayed by the hour. Potential market fallout. Shareholder consequences. Naomi watched all of it unfold with complete stillness. She did not look angry. She looked prepared. Richard placed both hands against the conference table and leaned closer toward her. Listen carefully, he said, lowering his voice. Do not destroy a billion-dollar opportunity over a misunderstanding. Naomi held his gaze without blinking. A misunderstanding, she repeated softly. Richard nodded quickly. Exactly. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair. You spent 40 minutes showing me exactly how this company treats people it believes are beneath it. Richard opened his mouth again, but Naomi continued before he could interrupt. You dismissed me before introductions. You prepared layoffs targeting minority leadership. You planned to erase community programs built over 10 years. Her eyes moved across the room now, landing briefly on every executive seated there. And the moment your assumptions became expensive, suddenly everyone wants professionalism. Nobody spoke. Nobody could. Naomi's voice remained low and controlled, but every sentence landed heavier than the last. You were comfortable disrespecting me when you thought I had no power, she said. Now you are afraid because you finally understand where the power was sitting all along. Richard stared at her in complete silence. And for the first time that morning, the most powerful man inside Halstead and Blythe Capital looked exactly like what he had spent the entire meeting assuming Naomi Carter was. Out of control. The conference room no longer sounded like a board meeting. It sounded like damage control. Phones vibrated nonstop across the walnut table, while legal advisors whispered urgently into headsets and investors refreshed market dashboards with tightening expressions. The polished certainty that filled the room an hour earlier had completely disappeared. In its place sat confusion, calculation, and fear. Naomi Carter remained perfectly calm at the center of it all. Richard Coleman stared at the notification still glowing on his phone screen, as though refusing to believe reality could move without his permission. You froze the transfer authorization, he said slowly. Do you understand what this does to the market? Naomi looked toward the rain-covered skyline beyond the windows before answering. Do you understand what disrespect does to people who live with it every day? Richard exhaled sharply. This is business. Naomi turned back toward him. Exactly. Evelyn Price stood from her chair now, abandoning the last pieces of polished diplomacy she had been hiding behind all morning. Enough, she snapped. This merger affects thousands of employees, pension accounts, infrastructure contracts across 5 states. You cannot jeopardize all of that because your ego got bruised during one meeting. The room went still again. Naomi looked at Evelyn carefully. Not offended, not angry, just deeply disappointed. My ego, Naomi repeated softly. Evelyn folded her arms tightly. That is what this is really about, is it not? Naomi slowly stood from her chair for the first time since entering the boardroom. Every eye followed her immediately. Even the rain outside seemed quieter now. Naomi was not physically imposing. She did not need to be. The authority surrounding her came from something harder to imitate. Control. You still do not understand, Naomi said calmly. This deal did not collapse because I was insulted. She looked around the room slowly, making sure every executive heard the next words clearly. It collapsed because you revealed who you become when you think someone has less power than you. Nobody moved. Daniel Brooks felt his pulse hammering in his chest as Naomi stepped away from the table and walked slowly toward the massive presentation screen still displaying frozen acquisition notices. The problem was never that you mistook me for staff, Naomi continued. The problem was how quickly you decided staff deserved disrespect. Silence swallowed the room completely after that. One investor lowered his eyes immediately. Another rubbed his forehead as though trying to undo the last 40 minutes retroactively. Richard tried stepping forward again, but his voice no longer carried the same confidence. Miss Carter, he said carefully, there is still time to salvage this. Naomi faced him fully now. Salvage what? Richard spread his hands. The partnership. Naomi gave the faintest shake of her head. You never wanted partnership. Her voice stayed calm enough to force everyone else into stillness. You wanted ownership without accountability. Evelyn scoffed quietly. That is dramatic. Naomi looked directly at her. No, it is expensive. The word landed like a door locking shut. Daniel watched the legal advisors now. None of them were interrupting anymore. None of them defended Richard or Evelyn, because lawyers understood risk better than anyone. And at this moment, the greatest liability inside the room was not the frozen acquisition. It was the behavior that led to it. Naomi returned to the conference table and picked up the original acquisition folder. She held it lightly in one hand while scanning the room one final time. 42 minutes, she said. Quietly. That is how long it took this room to show me exactly how your leadership behaves when it believes nobody important is watching. Richard's jaw tightened. You are turning this into something it was never meant to be. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. No, she replied softly. I stopped pretending it was something else. Another wave of phone notifications vibrated across the table. One investor muttered under his breath after reading the newest update. Halstead and Blythe stock declines after merger delay concerns. Evelyn immediately grabbed her phone. This is getting into the media already? Naomi did not react. Markets move quickly when confidence disappears. Richard stared at her in disbelief. You planned this. Naomi tilted her head slightly. I prepared for possibilities. Daniel could see it clearly now. Naomi had not walked into the boardroom hoping to destroy the deal. She had walked in hoping they would prove her wrong. And they failed almost immediately. Richard stepped closer again, lowering his voice as though quieter words could somehow rebuild authority. What exactly do you want? Naomi answered without hesitation. Leadership capable of recognizing humanity before hierarchy. Richard looked genuinely confused by the answer. That almost saddened Daniel more than everything else. Naomi placed the acquisition folder back onto the table with careful precision. You built an entire corporate culture around proximity to power, she said. That is why none of you noticed integrity leaving the room before the money did. The words settled heavily over everyone present. Evelyn looked away first. Then one investor after another avoided eye contact entirely. Nobody wanted to be the face Naomi's words attached themselves to. But it was too late for distance now. The room had already chosen sides through silence long before Naomi froze the transfer. Naomi reached for her coat draped neatly across the back of the chair. Slow movements. Controlled breathing. No triumph in her expression. Only clarity. Richard watched her carefully now with something close to desperation beneath the surface. If you walk away from this, he said. "The consequences will be enormous." Naomi slipped one arm into her coat sleeve and looked directly at him one final time. "That should have mattered to you before I entered the room." For several seconds after Naomi Carter spoke, nobody inside the conference room moved at all. The city beyond the glass walls continued through another rainy Manhattan morning. While inside Halstead and Blythe Capital, careers, reputations, and billions of dollars sat balanced on silence. Richard Coleman remained standing near the end of the walnut table, staring at Naomi as though he still believed confidence alone could reverse what had already happened. But the room had changed too much now. Even the air felt different. Controlled panic drifted beneath every polished expression. Legal advisors whispered into muted headsets. Investors refreshed market alerts every few seconds. Phones continued vibrating across the table like nervous heartbeats no one could quiet anymore. Naomi slipped her coat fully onto her shoulders with calm, measured movements. No rush. No anger. She looked like someone leaving a meeting that had simply reached its conclusion. Richard finally broke the silence again. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," he said. Naomi adjusted the cuff of her sleeve before answering. "No," she replied softly. "I am preventing one." Evelyn Price gave a bitter laugh from across the room. "This is unbelievable." Naomi turned toward her. "No," she said again. What was unbelievable was watching experienced executives decide a black woman could not possibly own the company funding this building. Nobody defended Evelyn after that. Nobody defended Richard either. Because the room knew Naomi was telling the truth now. Not emotionally. Factually. Daniel Brooks watched the investors carefully. Earlier that morning, they had looked at Naomi with quiet amusement. Now they avoided eye contact completely. One man near the far end of the table had already started drafting what looked like emergency emails to shareholders. Another sat motionless with both hands pressed against his forehead. The merger delay alone could trigger market instability before closing bell on Wall Street. But the greater danger was perception. Investors could survive delayed deals. They could not survive public exposure tied to discrimination, executive misconduct, and leadership failure. Naomi picked up her black leather portfolio from the table while the giant presentation monitor behind her flashed another system update across the screen. Acquisition review status. Suspended by majority authority holder. Richard looked toward the notification like it physically hurt to read it. "You realize this damages both companies," he said tightly. Naomi faced him calmly. "Then perhaps your leadership team should have treated this partnership with more intelligence." Richard shook his head slowly in disbelief. All of this because someone made assumptions during introductions. Naomi's expression remained steady. "You still think this started with introductions?" Her voice never rose above conversation level, but the room listened harder every time she spoke. "This started long before I walked into this building," Naomi continued. "It started in every room where people confuse appearance with authority. Every meeting where competence gets measured differently depending on who enters the door." Daniel felt those words settle directly into his chest. Across the room, one older investor quietly removed his glasses and leaned back in silence. Another legal advisor stopped typing entirely. The truth had become too obvious now to ignore professionally. Naomi moved toward the end of the table nearest the windows, rainlight reflecting softly across her dark coat. "You built policies targeting neighborhoods you never bothered understanding," she said. "You prepared layoffs affecting leaders who outperformed your own executives. And before any of you knew my name, you already decided where I belonged in this room." Evelyn tried one final time to defend herself. "Nobody here is racist." Naomi looked at her carefully. "That word makes people uncomfortable because they imagine it always arrives loudly." Silence followed immediately. Naomi continued. "Sometimes it sounds polite. Sometimes it hides behind professionalism. Sometimes it wears expensive suits and calls discrimination efficiency." Nobody interrupted her now. Nobody even tried. Because somewhere between the frozen wire transfer and the collapsing acquisition, the power structure inside the room had inverted completely. Naomi no longer needed to prove anything. The room was proving her right all by itself. Richard stepped closer again, lowering his voice in a final attempt at negotiation. "What exactly happens now?" Naomi glanced toward the legal advisors near the back wall. "Carter Global is initiating a full internal review of partnership eligibility." One investor immediately looked alarmed. Eligibility. Naomi nodded once. I do not place infrastructure, jobs, and community investment under leadership that cannot recognize basic human respect. Richard exhaled sharply. This is personal retaliation. Naomi met his eyes directly. No, this is executive judgment. The words landed like final paperwork sliding across a desk. Clean, precise, unavoidable. Another notification lit up across multiple phones simultaneously. Halstead and Blythe shares fall after strategic deal suspension. Evelyn looked down at her screen and visibly paled. One investor quietly muttered, "This is already spreading." Naomi watched the reactions around the room without satisfaction. That was what unsettled Daniel the most. She was not enjoying their collapse. She simply accepted it, like consequences, arriving exactly where they were always headed. Naomi turned toward the conference room doors, then paused one final time before leaving. "You know the most dangerous assumption powerful people make?" she asked quietly. Nobody answered. Naomi looked back over her shoulder toward the executives seated around the table. Believing dignity only matters when the person being disrespected has the power to punish them for it. The room stayed silent beneath the soft hum of recessed lighting and distant thunder beyond the skyline. Naomi rested one hand against the conference room door. "Character is revealed long before consequences arrive," she said. "Today you just happened to meet both at the same time." And as the door slowly opened behind her, nobody inside the billion-dollar boardroom could pretend anymore that the most powerful person in the building had ever been Richard Coleman. The conference room doors closed softly behind Naomi Carter, but the silence left inside Halstead and Blythe Capital felt louder than any argument that morning. Nobody spoke for several seconds after she walked out. Rain continued sliding down the towering glass windows overlooking Manhattan, while market alerts flashed red across phone screens around the table. Billion-dollar projections still glowed faintly on the frozen presentation monitor, now meaningless against the reality settling over the room. Richard Coleman remained standing near the head of the conference table, staring at the closed doors as though he expected Naomi to return and reverse everything through mercy alone. But nothing moved except the quiet panic spreading beneath expensive suits and polished executive expressions. Daniel Brooks watched the room carefully from his place near the wall. Earlier that morning, these executives controlled every conversation. Now they looked smaller somehow. Not financially, spiritually. Like power had been stripped away from appearances and forced to stand exposed beneath fluorescent light. Evelyn Price finally broke the silence first. "We need legal containment immediately," she said sharply, grabbing her phone again. One attorney answered without looking up from his laptop. "The problem is not only the acquisition suspension anymore." Evelyn frowned. "What does that mean?" The attorney hesitated carefully before speaking. 3 investors already requested independent review documentation regarding leadership conduct during negotiations. The room tightened instantly. Richard slowly lowered himself into his chair for the first time since Naomi activated Protocol 9. He looked exhausted now, not physically tired, deflated. The kind of exhaustion that arrives when someone realizes consequences no longer belong to the future. They are already happening. "This cannot leave the room," Richard muttered quietly. Daniel almost looked away after hearing it. Because that sentence explained everything. Not concern about what happened. Concern about exposure. Concern about reputation. Naomi had been right from the beginning. Richard looked toward the legal team again. "Draft a statement," he ordered. "Miscommunication during strategic negotiations. Temporary review process. Nothing else." Nobody responded immediately. The hesitation itself felt dangerous. One investor finally spoke from the far end of the table. "With respect, Richard, this is larger than public relations now." Richard's eyes snapped toward him. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" The investor leaned back slowly in his chair. "It means several people in this room watched a black woman walk into a meeting controlling the future of this acquisition and still assumed she belonged carrying coffee instead of leading negotiations." Silence swallowed the table again. No one defended Richard this time. No one defended Evelyn either. Because once truth gets spoken aloud clearly enough, denial starts sounding childish even to the people hiding behind it. Daniel quietly gathered abandoned folders from the side table while executives argued softly about damage control, investor confidence, and media exposure. But the deeper he listened, the more obvious something became. Nobody was talking about dignity. Nobody was talking about accountability. They were only discussing fallout. That realization settled heavily in his chest. Meanwhile, Naomi Carter stepped calmly through the executive hallway outside the boardroom, her heels echoing softly against polished marble floors. Employees glanced up from reception desks and glass offices as she passed. Some recognized her immediately now after internal alerts spread across company systems. Others simply sensed authority in the way the hallway seemed to shift around her presence. At the end of the corridor, elevator doors opened quietly. Naomi stepped inside alone. As the doors closed, she finally allowed herself one slow breath. Not relief. Reflection. Her phone vibrated gently in her hand. Sophia. Naomi answered calmly. It is done, Sophia said. Board review procedures are already underway. Investor calls begin in 20 minutes. Naomi nodded faintly. Good. There was a pause on the line before Sophia asked softly, Are you all right? Naomi looked at her reflection in the mirrored elevator walls. Calm eyes. Controlled posture. The same composure her mother taught her years ago while cleaning office buildings. People believed invisible workers would never own one day. I will be, Naomi replied quietly. The elevator descended floor by floor toward the Manhattan lobby below. 41, 40, 39. Somewhere above her, executives were still trying to calculate financial losses. But Naomi understood something they did not. Money recovers faster than character does. By the time the elevator doors opened into the marble lobby, rain had started easing outside. Security guards near the entrance straightened subtly when they saw her approach. One young receptionist offered a respectful smile. Naomi returned it warmly before stepping toward the revolving doors leading out to the street. Midtown Manhattan moved around her in gray reflections and wet pavement while taxis splashed through intersections beneath clearing skies. Naomi paused briefly beneath the awning outside the building and looked back once toward the towering glass structure disappearing into the clouds above. Somewhere inside those offices, people were still discussing billions. But she kept thinking about her mother holding that forgotten champagne glass beside a cleaning cart 15 years earlier. Dignity. That was always the real currency. Not titles. Not stock prices. Not acquisitions. Dignity was what revealed who people became when they believed no one important was watching. Naomi stepped away from the building and disappeared into the moving rhythm of the city, while behind her the consequences continued unfolding floor by floor inside Halstead and Blythe Capital. Richard Coleman would spend the next several months defending his leadership before nervous investors. Evelyn Price would quietly resign before the end of the quarter. Internal reviews would expose hiring disparities, targeted restructuring patterns, and years of polished discrimination hidden beneath executive language. And Daniel Brooks would remember that morning for the rest of his life. Not because a billion-dollar deal collapsed, but because he watched a black woman walk into a room where people underestimated her within seconds and still leave with something none of them could buy back after losing it. The moral authority of the room itself. Naomi never raised her voice that morning. She never threatened anyone. She never demanded respect. She simply revealed what happened when power met character and character failed the test. And somewhere beneath the fading rain over Manhattan, the city kept moving while one truth remained behind inside that silent boardroom long after Naomi Carter was gone. The most dangerous people are not the loudest ones in the room. They are the calm ones who already know exactly who they are.